What you're about to hear is a tale so chilling, so steeped in supernatural terror and human greed, that it has haunted the murky waters of Louisiana's Bayou country for over a century. This is not merely a story of gambling gone wrong or a riverboat accident lost to time. This is the documented account of 27 men who ventured into the forbidden waters of Devil's Bayou in search of the ultimate game, and the 5 survivors whose testimonies would shake New Orleans society to its very core. This is the true story of the Crimson Queen's final voyage, where the stakes were higher than money, and the house always wins. The year was 1893, and New Orleans was experiencing what historians would later call the Golden Age of river gambling. The mighty Mississippi River served as a highway for fortune seekers, con artists, and professional gamblers who made their living on the floating palaces that churned through the muddy waters day and night. These riverboat casinos were more than mere vessels. They were floating cities of sin where fortunes were won and lost with the turn of a card, and where a man's reputation could be built or destroyed in a single evening. Among the most notorious of these gambling establishments was the Crimson Queen, a magnificent side-wheeler that had earned a reputation as the most exclusive and dangerous gaming venue on the entire river system. Owned by a mysterious figure known only as Captain Beauregard Thibodeau, the Crimson Queen catered to only the wealthiest and most skilled gamblers, men who had already proven themselves at lesser establishments and sought the ultimate test of their abilities. Captain Thibodeau was a figure shrouded in mystery and contradiction. Some claimed he was a former Confederate officer who had turned to gambling after the war, while others whispered that he was something far older and more sinister. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with piercing gray eyes and prematurely white hair, Thibodeau commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His voice carried the cultured accent of old Louisiana aristocracy, but those who looked closely could see something predatory lurking behind his gentleman's facade. The Crimson Queen herself was a marvel of engineering and opulence. Her 3 decks were appointed with the finest furnishings money could buy: crystal chandeliers from Paris, mahogany gaming tables crafted by master artisans, and Persian carpets that muffled the sound of footsteps and whispered conversations. The main gaming salon could accommodate over 100 players, while private rooms on the upper deck hosted the highest stakes games where fortunes equivalent to modern millions changed hands in a single night. But it was the boat's most exclusive feature that drew the attention of the 27 gamblers who would board her on that fateful October evening in 1893. Hidden away on the uppermost deck was a single room known as the Devil's Table, where Captain Thibodeau himself presided over games that were said to offer stakes beyond mere money. Rumors circulated throughout the gambling community about men who had played at the Devil's Table and emerged either fabulously wealthy or completely ruined, not just financially, but in ways that defied explanation. The 27 men who gathered at the New Orleans docks on October 13, 1893, represented the cream of the river gambling world. They came from across the South and beyond, drawn by an invitation that had arrived mysteriously at their homes or hotels exactly 1 month prior. The invitation, written on expensive parchment in an elegant script, bore the seal of the Crimson Queen and promised a game unlike any other, where the truly bold may claim prizes beyond imagination. Among the invited were some of the most legendary figures in gambling history. There was Diamond Jim Boudreaux, a Creole gentleman who had never lost a game of poker in 20 years of professional play. His trademark diamond stickpin and perfectly waxed mustache made him instantly recognizable in gambling circles from Memphis to Mobile. Diamond Jim's reputation was built not just on his skill with cards, but on his uncanny ability to read his opponent's tells and his ice-cold nerves under pressure. Another notable figure was Colonel Thaddeus Blackwood, a former Union cavalry officer who had turned his military strategic mind to the gaming tables after the war. Blackwood specialized in complex betting games and was known for his ability to calculate odds with mathematical precision. His stern demeanor and military bearing made him a formidable opponent who rarely showed emotion regardless of whether he was winning or losing spectacular amounts. From the riverboat circuit came Lucky Louis Fontaine, a young Cajun whose meteoric rise in the gambling world had made him both famous and envied. Despite being only 28 years old, Lucky Louis had already accumulated a fortune through his seemingly supernatural ability to predict the fall of dice and the turn of cards. His boyish charm and easy smile masked a razor-sharp intellect and an almost supernatural intuition for games of chance. The group also included several international players who had traveled specifically for this mysterious invitation. Count Alessandro Montecros had journeyed from Italy, bringing with him centuries of European gaming tradition and a reputation for high-stakes baccarat that had made him wealthy beyond measure. His aristocratic bearing and old-world manners provided an interesting contrast to the rougher American gamblers, but his skill at the tables was undeniable. From the gambling halls of San Francisco came Chen Weiming, a Chinese immigrant who had built an empire through his mastery of traditional Asian gambling games and his adaptation of those skills to Western card games. Despite facing considerable prejudice in the predominantly white gambling world, Chen's abilities had earned him grudging respect and substantial wealth. His presence at the gathering indicated the truly international scope of Captain Thibodeau's reputation. The remaining 22 men represented a cross-section of American gambling society, plantation owners seeking to multiply their wealth, northern industrialists looking for excitement, professional gamblers from river towns throughout the Mississippi system, and a few mysterious figures whose backgrounds remained deliberately obscure. What united them all was their reputation for high-stakes play and their willingness to risk everything for the chance at ultimate victory. As the sun set over New Orleans on that October evening, the 27 gamblers boarded the Crimson Queen at a private dock away from the main commercial wharves. The secrecy surrounding their departure was deliberate. Captain Thibodeau had made it clear that their destination and the nature of their game were to remain confidential. Each man had been required to bring a substantial buy-in, with the minimum stake set at $10,000, a fortune in 1893 equivalent to hundreds of thousands in today's currency. The Crimson Queen departed New Orleans under cover of darkness, her paddle wheels churning silently through the black waters of the Mississippi. Captain Thibodeau had personally taken the helm, dismissing his usual crew and replacing them with a skeleton staff of men whose loyalty was absolute and whose silence was guaranteed. The regular passengers and crew had been given the evening off, leaving only the 27 gamblers and Thibodeau's hand-picked men aboard the vessel. As the riverboat made its way downstream, the gamblers gathered in the main salon for what they assumed would be preliminary games to pass the time until they reached their mysterious destination. The atmosphere was convivial, with expensive whiskey flowing freely and cigars creating a haze that softened the light from the crystal chandeliers. These men were accustomed to luxury and high-stakes gaming, but even they were impressed by the opulence of their surroundings. Diamond Jim Boudreaux held court at one of the poker tables, regaling younger players with stories of legendary games and famous victories. His diamond stickpin caught the light as he gestured, and his cultured Creole accent lent an air of sophistication to even his most outrageous tales. The other players listened with a mixture of admiration and calculation, each trying to gauge the legendary gambler's current form and mental state. Colonel Blackwood had found a quiet corner where he could observe the other players while nursing a single glass of bourbon. His military training had taught him the value of reconnaissance, and he was using this social time to study his potential opponents. He noted Lucky Louis's nervous habit of tapping his fingers when excited, Count Montecro's tendency to stroke his beard when contemplating a difficult decision, and Chen Weiming's almost supernatural stillness when concentrating. The conversation among the gamblers gradually turned to speculation about their destination and the nature of the game they had been invited to play. Some theorized that they were heading to a private plantation where a wealthy eccentric had constructed an elaborate gaming facility. Others suggested that Captain Thibodeau had discovered a way to circumvent gambling laws by conducting his games in international waters or on Indian territory. But as the night wore on and the Crimson Queen continued its journey into increasingly unfamiliar waters, a sense of unease began to settle over the group. The riverboat had left the main channel of the Mississippi and was now navigating through a maze of smaller waterways that led deep into the Louisiana Bayou country. The familiar sounds of river traffic had faded away, replaced by the eerie calls of night birds and the splash of unseen creatures moving through the dark water. Captain Thibodeau appeared periodically to check on his guests, his tall figure moving silently through the salon like a specter. When questioned about their destination, he would only smile and assure them that they would reach their goal before dawn. His presence was both reassuring and unsettling. While his courtesy was impeccable, there was something in his gray eyes that suggested depths of knowledge and experience that went far beyond normal human understanding. As midnight approached, the Crimson Queen entered a section of bayou that none of the gamblers recognized. The water here was black as ink, reflecting the stars like a dark mirror. Ancient cypress trees draped with Spanish moss created a canopy overhead, blocking out much of the moonlight and creating an atmosphere of primordial mystery. The air itself seemed different here, thick and heavy with an almost tangible sense of age and secrets. It was Lucky Lewis who first noticed the strange behavior of the wildlife. The young Cajun had grown up in Bayou country and was familiar with its natural rhythms. But what he observed that night defied his experience. The usual chorus of frogs and insects had fallen silent, replaced by an unnatural quiet that seemed to press against the eardrums. Even more disturbing, the alligators that should have been active in the warm October night were nowhere to be seen, as if they had fled from something that even apex predators feared. The temperature began to drop as they penetrated deeper into the bayou. Despite the fact that October in Louisiana typically remained warm well into the night, several of the gamblers commented on the unusual chill, pulling their coats tighter and moving closer to the salon's ornate fireplaces. The crew members, who had been maintaining their professional demeanor throughout the evening, began to show signs of nervousness, casting frequent glances toward the dark water and whispering among themselves in languages that the gamblers couldn't identify. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, the Crimson Queen's engines suddenly fell silent. The great paddle wheels ceased their rhythmic churning, and the riverboat began to drift with the current through the black water. Captain Thibodeau appeared on the main deck and announced that they had reached their destination, a place he called Devil's Bayou, where the most exclusive game in the world was about to begin. The gamblers gathered on deck to see where they had arrived, but the darkness was so complete that they could make out little beyond the vague shapes of massive trees and the occasional glimmer of starlight on water. The air was filled with an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even their own voices, and several men reported feeling dizzy or disoriented, as if the very atmosphere of this place was somehow wrong. Captain Thibodeau led the group to the uppermost deck of the Crimson Queen, where a single door marked with strange symbols opened to reveal the Devil's Table. The room beyond was unlike anything the gamblers had ever seen. The walls were lined with what appeared to be ancient wood, dark with age and carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move in the flickering light of black candles. The air inside was warm despite the chill outside, and it carried a faint scent of sulfur and something else that none of them could identify, but that made their skin crawl. The table itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, carved from a single piece of what looked like black marble but felt warm to the touch. Its surface was perfectly smooth except for the strange symbols that were inlaid around its edge in what appeared to be silver, though the metal had an unusual luster that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 28 chairs surrounded the table, each one unique and apparently crafted from different types of wood, some of which the gamblers couldn't identify. Captain Thibodeau took his place at the head of the table and explained the rules of the game they were about to play. It was a variation of poker unlike anything they had encountered before, with additional cards bearing symbols that predated any known playing card designs. The stakes, he explained, would not be measured in money alone. Each player would wager not just their financial resources, but something far more precious and irreplaceable. The nature of these additional stakes was deliberately vague, but Captain Thibodeau assured them that the winners would gain rewards beyond their wildest dreams, while the losers would forfeit things they didn't even know they possessed. The cryptic explanation troubled some of the gamblers, but their competitive nature and the substantial buy-ins they had already paid made retreat impossible. They had come too far and risked too much to back down now. As the game began, the atmosphere in the room became increasingly oppressive. The black candles burned with flames that cast no shadows, and the temperature seemed to fluctuate wildly, sometimes becoming almost unbearably hot, then dropping to a bone-chilling cold that made the players' breath visible in the air. Several gamblers reported feeling watched, as if invisible eyes were observing their every move from the darkness beyond the candlelight. The cards themselves seemed to have a life of their own. They felt unusually warm to the touch, and some players swore they could feel a faint vibration or pulse when they held certain combinations. The strange symbols on the additional cards seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally, and more than one gambler found himself staring at a card only to discover that its face had somehow altered while he wasn't looking directly at it. As the hours passed and the game progressed, the players began to notice disturbing changes in themselves and their fellow gamblers. Diamond Jim Boudreau, normally the most composed and charming of men, became increasingly agitated and paranoid, constantly checking and rechecking his cards as if he couldn't trust his own eyes. His famous diamond stickpin seemed to have lost its luster, appearing dull and lifeless in the strange candlelight. Colonel Blackwood's military bearing began to crack as the night wore on. The disciplined officer who had faced Confederate cavalry charges without flinching found himself jumping at shadows and starting at sounds that only he seemed to hear. His hands, which had always been steady whether holding a sword or cards, began to tremble uncontrollably, making it difficult for him to manage his hand. Lucky Lewis, whose boyish charm and easy confidence had made him a favorite in gambling circles throughout the South, seemed to age years with each passing hour. His face became gaunt and drawn, his eyes sunken and haunted, and his legendary luck appeared to have completely abandoned him. The young man who had never met a game he couldn't master found himself losing hand after hand, his stack of chips dwindling with each round. Count Montecros, the sophisticated European aristocrat, began to exhibit behavior that was completely at odds with his refined upbringing. He would mutter in languages that sounded ancient and guttural, nothing like the cultured Italian he normally spoke. His aristocratic features seemed to coarsen and become more primitive, as if centuries of breeding and civilization were being stripped away with each card that was dealt. Chen Weiming, whose supernatural stillness had always been his greatest asset at the gaming table, became increasingly agitated and restless. The Chinese gambler, who had built his reputation on patience and careful calculation, began making wild, irrational bets that defied all logic and strategy. His eyes, normally calm and calculating, took on a wild, desperate gleam that spoke of a man losing more than just money. As dawn approached, the true horror of their situation began to become clear. The 27 gamblers were not simply playing for money or even for their earthly possessions, they were wagering their very souls, their memories, their identities, and their connections to everything that made them human. Captain Thibodeau, it became apparent, was not merely a riverboat captain or even a supernatural entity, but something far more ancient and malevolent. The game that had started with 28 players began to see its numbers dwindle in ways that defied explanation. Players didn't simply lose and leave the table, they began to fade away entirely, as if they were being erased from existence itself. Their chairs would suddenly be empty, their chips would vanish, and even the memory of their presence would begin to slip away from the minds of the remaining players. The first to disappear was a plantation owner from Mississippi whose name the survivors would later be unable to recall. One moment he was there, desperately trying to bluff his way out of a losing hand, and the next his chair was empty as if he had never existed. The other players looked around in confusion, sensing that something was wrong but unable to remember exactly what. As the night progressed, more players began to vanish in similar fashion. Each disappearance was accompanied by a subtle shift in reality, as if the very fabric of existence was being rewoven to exclude the missing individuals. Photographs in wallets would show empty spaces where faces should have been, and letters in pockets would bear signatures that no one could read or remember. By the time the sun began to rise over Devil's Bayou, only 5 players remained at the table: Diamond Jim Boudreau, Colonel Blackwood, Lucky Louis Fontaine, Count Montecros, and Chen Weiming. These 5 men, who had entered the game as confident masters of their craft, now sat as broken shells of their former selves, having witnessed horrors that their minds could barely comprehend. Captain Thibodeau, who had remained unchanged throughout the night's supernatural proceedings, finally revealed his true nature. As the first rays of sunlight penetrated the canopy of the bayou, his human facade began to slip away, revealing something ancient and terrible that had been masquerading as a man. His gray eyes became pools of darkness that seemed to contain the screams of all his previous victims, and his voice took on harmonics that no human throat could produce. The entity that had called itself Captain Thibodeau explained that Devil's Bayou was a place where the barriers between worlds were thin, where creatures like himself could cross over from realms of nightmare and shadow. The Crimson Queen had been his hunting ground for decades, luring the most skilled and confident gamblers to this isolated place where their souls could be harvested without interference from the mortal world. The 5 survivors were spared not out of mercy, but because their terror and trauma would serve a purpose. They were to return to the world of men and spread the story of what had happened in Devil's Bayou, ensuring that the legend would grow and that more victims would eventually be drawn to seek out the ultimate game. Their survival was part of a larger design, a way of ensuring that the entity's hunting grounds would never lack for prey. As the sun rose higher, the Crimson Queen began to fade like morning mist, taking with it the creature that had masqueraded as Captain Thibodeau and all evidence of the night's supernatural events. The 5 survivors found themselves floating in the bayou water, clinging to debris from what appeared to be an ordinary riverboat that had suffered some kind of accident. Their memories of the night's events were intact, but all physical evidence of the supernatural game had vanished. When rescue boats found the 5 men later that morning, they were in a state of complete psychological collapse. Diamond Jim Boudreau, the legendary gambler who had never lost his composure, was found catatonic, staring at his hands as if he couldn't understand what they were. Colonel Blackwood, the disciplined military officer, was babbling incoherently about cards that changed their faces and chairs that emptied themselves of human souls. Lucky Louis Fontaine, the young Cajun whose luck had been legendary, aged 20 years in a single night and would never gamble again, his boyish features had become those of an old man, and his eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of knowledge too terrible to bear. Count Montecros returned to Italy immediately upon his recovery, but those who knew him said he was never the same, spending his remaining years in seclusion, afraid to sleep because of the nightmares that plagued him. Chen Wei-ming disappeared entirely after giving his testimony to authorities. Some said he returned to China, while others claimed he had retreated to a monastery somewhere in the mountains of California. Regardless of his destination, he was never seen in gambling circles again, his supernatural stillness replaced by a constant trembling that spoke of nerves shattered beyond repair. The official investigation into the incident concluded that the Crimson Queen had suffered a boiler explosion while navigating the treacherous waters of the bayou. The 22 missing passengers were presumed dead, their bodies lost in the murky depths of the swamp. The 5 survivors were treated for shock and exposure, and their accounts of supernatural events were attributed to trauma and the hallucinations that often accompany near-death experiences. But the gambling community knew better. Word of the Devil's Bayou incident spread through the underground networks of professional gamblers, riverboat crews, and others who made their living in the shadowy world of high-stakes gaming. The story grew with each telling, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking games where the stakes were too high and the house advantage too great. In the years that followed, several expeditions attempted to locate Devil's Bayou and find evidence of what had really happened to the Crimson Queen. None of these efforts were successful, as if the location itself had been erased from the geography of Louisiana. Maps that had once shown the waterway now depicted only solid land, and local guides claimed no knowledge of any place by that name. The 5 survivors, when they could be convinced to speak about their experience, told remarkably consistent stories despite having no contact with each other after their rescue. They described the same supernatural card game, the same malevolent entity masquerading as Captain Thibodeau, and the same horrific fate that had befallen their fellow gamblers. Their consistency lent credibility to their accounts, even among skeptics who preferred rational explanations for unexplained events. Diamond Jim Boudreau eventually recovered enough to function in society, but he never played cards again. The man who had once been the most feared poker player on the Mississippi became a recluse, spending his remaining years writing detailed accounts of his experience in Devil's Bayou. His journals, discovered after his death in 1910, provided the most complete record of the supernatural events and served as a warning to future generations of gamblers. Colonel Blackwood returned to his military career but was never able to achieve the same level of success he had enjoyed before his encounter with the entity in Devil's Bayou. His superiors noted a decline in his decision-making abilities and his confidence in high-pressure situations that he retired early from the army and spent his final years as a small-town sheriff. Far from the gambling halls that had once been his second home, the incident had lasting effects on the riverboat gambling industry. Throughout the Mississippi River system, many professional gamblers became more cautious about accepting mysterious invitations or participating in games where the rules were unclear. The story of Devil's Bayou became a part of gambling folklore, passed down from veteran players to newcomers as a warning about the dangers of greed and overconfidence. Some historians have suggested that the Devil's Bayou incident was actually an elaborate hoax designed to eliminate competition among professional gamblers. According to this theory, Captain Thibodeau was a real person who used psychological manipulation and possibly drugs to create the illusion of supernatural events while actually murdering his victims. However, this explanation fails to account for the complete disappearance of the 22 missing gamblers and the lack of any physical evidence of their deaths. Paranormal investigators have long been fascinated by the Devil's Bayou case, seeing it as one of the most well-documented examples of supernatural activity in American history. The consistency of the survivors' accounts, the complete disappearance of the missing gamblers, and the inability to locate the site of the incident have made it a subject of ongoing study and speculation. Modern researchers have attempted to use satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar to locate Devil's Bayou, but these efforts have been unsuccessful. The Louisiana Bayou country covers thousands of square miles of wetlands, and the waterways are constantly changing due to erosion, sedimentation, and human intervention. If Devil's Bayou ever existed as a physical location, it may have been altered beyond recognition by more than a century of environmental change. The psychological profiles of the 5 survivors have been studied extensively by researchers interested in trauma and its effects on memory and perception. All 5 men exhibited symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but their accounts remained remarkably consistent even under hypnosis and other investigative techniques designed to reveal false memories or deliberate deception. The case has also attracted the attention of researchers studying group psychology and mass hysteria. Some have suggested that the 5 survivors experienced a shared psychotic episode brought on by stress, isolation, and possibly toxic substances in the bayou environment. However, this explanation struggles to account for the physical evidence of the missing gamblers and the complete absence of any trace of the Crimson Queen. Religious scholars have interpreted the Devil's Bayou incident as an example of demonic activity, pointing to the supernatural elements of the story and the entities' apparent ability to harvest human souls. Some have suggested that the location was a thin place where the barriers between the physical and spiritual worlds were weakened, allowing malevolent entities to cross over and interact with the mortal realm. The influence of the Devil's Bayou story extends beyond academic circles into popular culture, where it has inspired numerous books, films, and other works of fiction. These adaptations often take liberties with the historical facts, but they serve to keep the story alive in public consciousness and ensure that new generations learn about the mysterious events of that October night in 1893. The gambling community continues to regard the Devil's Bayou incident as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing games where the stakes are unclear or the house advantage is unknown. Professional gamblers often invoke the story when warning newcomers about the importance of understanding the rules and knowing when to walk away from a game. Modern casinos and gaming establishments have occasionally referenced the Devil's Bayou story in their marketing, though always in a light-hearted way that emphasizes the fictional nature of the supernatural elements. The story has become part of gambling mythology, alongside other legendary tales of spectacular wins and devastating losses that define the culture of professional gaming. The 5 survivors' descendants have occasionally come forward with additional information about their ancestors' experiences, though these accounts are often secondhand and may have been influenced by decades of retelling and embellishment. Some family members report that the survivors continued to experience supernatural phenomena throughout their lives, including prophetic dreams and encounters with entities that seem to be connected to their experience in Devil's Bayou. Law enforcement agencies in Louisiana occasionally receive reports from individuals claiming to have encountered the Crimson Queen or Captain Thibodeau in various bayou locations. These reports are typically dismissed as hoaxes or the products of overactive imaginations influenced by the well-known legend. However, the consistency of certain details in these accounts has led some investigators to wonder if there might be some truth to the claims. The environmental conditions that allegedly existed in Devil's Bayou have been the subject of scientific study, with researchers attempting to understand how such an isolated and apparently supernatural location could exist within the known geography of Louisiana. Some have suggested that certain atmospheric conditions in swampland environments could create optical illusions and psychological effects that might account for some of the reported phenomena. The complete disappearance of 22 individuals without any trace remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Even if the supernatural elements are dismissed, the fact that no bodies, personal effects, or other evidence of these men was ever found is difficult to explain through conventional means. The efficiency of the disappearance suggests either supernatural intervention or an extremely sophisticated criminal operation. The timing of the incident, occurring during a period of significant social and economic change in the American South, has led some historians to interpret it as a metaphor for the death of the Old South and the gambling culture that had flourished along the Mississippi River. The destruction of the old order and the emergence of new social structures could be seen as reflected in the supernatural transformation that occurred in Devil's Bayou. The psychological impact of the incident on the broader gambling community was significant and long-lasting. Many professional gamblers became more cautious about accepting invitations to exclusive games, and the incident contributed to the decline of riverboat gambling as a major form of entertainment. The rise of land-based casinos and more regulated gaming environments can be partially attributed to the fear and uncertainty generated by stories like the Devil's Bayou incident. Contemporary accounts from New Orleans newspapers of the period provide additional context for the incident, though they focus primarily on the official explanation of a riverboat accident. The reluctance of authorities to investigate the supernatural claims made by the survivors reflects the social attitudes of the time, when such accounts were typically dismissed as superstition or the products of traumatized minds. The influence of the Devil's Bayou story on subsequent gambling folklore cannot be overstated. Elements of the tale appear in numerous other stories about supernatural gaming, cursed cards, and deals with demonic entities. The archetype of the mysterious host who offers ultimate stakes in exchange for ultimate risks has become a standard element in gambling mythology. Modern psychological analysis of the survivors' accounts has revealed interesting patterns in their descriptions of the supernatural events. All 5 men reported similar sensory experiences, including changes in temperature, unusual sounds, and visual distortions that suggest either shared hallucinations or genuine supernatural phenomena. The consistency of these details across independent accounts is difficult to explain through conventional psychological theories. The technological limitations of 1893 make it impossible to verify many aspects of the survivors' accounts through physical evidence. Modern investigative techniques that might reveal traces of the missing gamblers or evidence of the Crimson Queen were not available at the time, and any such evidence would likely have deteriorated beyond recognition in the intervening century. The cultural impact of the Devil's Bayou incident extends beyond the gambling community to influence broader American folklore about the supernatural dangers lurking in remote wilderness areas. The story fits into a larger pattern of tales about travelers who venture into forbidden territories and encounter entities that exist outside the normal rules of reality. The economic implications of the incident were significant for the families of the missing gamblers, many of whom had invested substantial sums in what they believed would be a profitable gaming venture. The complete loss of these investments, combined with the disappearance of the primary breadwinners, caused financial hardship for numerous families throughout the South and beyond. The legal challenges posed by the incident were complex and unprecedented. How does one prove the death of individuals who have seemingly been erased from existence? The families of the missing gamblers faced significant difficulties in settling estates and claiming life insurance benefits when no bodies could be produced and the circumstances of death were so unclear. The incident also raised questions about the regulation of gambling activities and the responsibility of authorities to protect citizens from dangerous or fraudulent gaming operations. The complete lack of oversight that allowed the Crimson Queen to operate in such secrecy contributed to calls for increased regulation of the gambling industry. The 5 survivors' later lives were marked by their shared trauma and the burden of carrying knowledge that few would believe. They formed an informal support network, corresponding regularly and meeting occasionally to discuss their experiences and their ongoing psychological effects. These meetings continued until the last survivor's death in 1934, exactly 41 years after the incident. The story of Devil's Bayou has been preserved not only through the survivors' accounts but also through the oral traditions of Louisiana's Cajun and Creole communities. Local storytellers have kept the tale alive for generations, often adding their own embellishments and interpretations that reflect the cultural values and beliefs of their communities. The incident has also influenced the development of modern paranormal investigation techniques, as researchers have used the detailed accounts provided by the survivors as a template for documenting and analyzing supernatural phenomena. The consistency and specificity of their descriptions have provided valuable insights into how multiple witnesses experience and remember extraordinary events. As we reach the end of this harrowing journey into the dark waters of Devil's Bayou, we are left with more questions than answers. What really happened to those 22 men who sailed into the Louisiana swampland on that October night in 1893? Was Captain Thibodeau a supernatural entity feeding on human souls, or was he something even more sinister, a man who had discovered how to manipulate reality itself for his own dark purposes? The 5 survivors took their secrets to their graves, but their testimonies remain as a warning to all who would seek to test fate at games where the stakes are higher than money and the house advantage extends beyond the merely mathematical. In the murky waters of Louisiana's Bayou country, where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural have always been thin, some games are simply too dangerous to play. The Crimson Queen may have vanished with the morning mist, but the legend lives on in the whispered stories of gamblers who know that some invitations should never be accepted, and some tables should never be approached. For in the end, when you gamble with forces beyond human understanding, the house always wins, and the price of losing may be more than your life, it may be your very soul. If this chilling tale of supernatural gambling and the price of greed has left you questioning what lies beneath the surface of our everyday world, please show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps us continue to uncover these forgotten chapters of history that remind us why some mysteries are better left unsolved. And if you haven't already joined our community of truth seekers here at Bayou Nightmares, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We delve deep into the shadows of history every week, bringing you stories that mainstream sources often overlook or dismiss. From the haunted waterways of Louisiana to the dark corners of human nature, we explore the mysteries that shaped our world. It's important to remember that while the stories we share on Bayou Nightmares are carefully researched and based on historical accounts, they are presented as entertainment and educational content. Some elements may be dramatized or interpreted through the lens of folklore and legend, though they are often inspired by real events and genuine human experiences that deserve to be remembered and understood. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, keep questioning the official narratives, keep seeking the truth behind the legends, and remember that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that hide behind the facade of respectability and charm. This has been Bayou Nightmares, where the past never truly dies, and the darkest secrets eventually find their way to the light.